Okay, so hello everyone. Thank you all for joining us on this virtual panel. Now, in my snapshot, I'd like to touch on what is being described as the new crime-terror nexus, or in other words, the convergence between crime and jihadism that is taking place in some parts of Europe. So that's the structure of the presentation. And the first thing I'd like to say is that this is not a new phenomenon at all. But there is no question that the problem has become much more visible with the emergence of ISIS. Based on a number of studies, we can estimate that about half of Europe's ISIS members had a criminal record. Now, these figures do vary quite a lot depending on the study, and there's significant country-to-country variation. But overall, the data show quite an striking overlap between crime and violent religious extremism. So these numbers have led some to argue that this goes farther than the way organized crime and militants had collaborated in the past. Indeed, in a 2016 report, Basra, Neumann, and Bronner argued that what we're seeing here is not the convergence of criminals and terrorists as organizations, but of their social networks, environments, or milieu. So these days, the argument goes, criminals and jihadists have very similar profiles, and they often come from the same backgrounds. Now, this is quite a fundamental change from the way we used to look at this issue. So this was a very influential report that encouraged quite a lot of new research. And that includes a paper that Aleko Kupadasse from King's College London and I myself produced in 2019 about this topic. Now, what we did in this paper was to develop a model, a typology to help make sense of these developments. And in our work, we have just suggested that the confluence between crime and European jihadism can be captured by three different dimensions: a functional, financial, and ideological. Now, with functional confluence, we refer to the relationship between criminal skills and militant experience. And this is a process where criminals provide logistical and operational support to a radical network whose members are acquaintances, friends, or even relatives. So these people are not strangers to each other. Instead, strong social bonds are crucial. Personal relationships, individual loyalties, and family ties are essential for the process. And they are because they not only help to bring criminals and extremists together, they also reinforce the radicalization processes within the group. Now, these tight connections can develop in the most mundane of places, yet they are more evident in those places, in those geographical areas where criminal networks and gangs are already well established. Areas such as marginalized neighborhoods of some European cities, places like Molenbeek in Brussels, or the Paris banlieue, or the Príncipe Alfonso district in the Spanish enclave of Ceuta. What these and other European neighborhoods share is that they experience a cocktail of deprivation, disenfranchised youth, petty crime, and jihadism. Now, in these and other areas, young Muslim men with experiences of discrimination, they seek alternative kinship networks in the margins of society. So in these settings, gangs and extremists very much draw from the same demographics, the same pool of recruits. There are young, second, or third generation Muslims with a history of social criminal delinquency, who sometimes, in some places, they mix gangster and jihadist cultures, and who gain status or street cred by joining the jihad. Now, the second element in our typology is financial confluence. We use the term to describe a process involving two different kinds of people, either criminals turning jihadists, or militants with a criminal background who use crime on an ad hoc, temporary basis. Now, these individuals, they turn to crime to cover the cost of terrorist plots, procurement, training, safe houses, travel, and more. But what is not that well known, or perhaps hasn't been as widely reported, is that these proceeds may also be diverted abroad to help funding foreign terrorist organizations. And this has been done in the past by transferring money through the Hawala system, or by foreign fighters acting as cash couriers. Now, when we think about the most common types of crime that these individuals have been using, drug trafficking comes very much at the top of the list. It is the staple in the jihadist diet, so to speak. But it's still striking the wide variety of illegal activities that have been funded, that have been used to fund terrorist plots in Europe, from firearms and human trafficking through financial crime to property crime and more. So these schemes can be highly sophisticated and even have a strong transnational dimension. We've seen groups in different countries having a strong connections and even self-funding the activities of other networks within other European countries. But generally, individuals have been engaged in what is being described as fairly ordinary domestic offenses. Now, that's the pattern. That's most of the crime has been like that. But what we need to consider is that even small sums of money collected over time can be effective and dependable sources of funding, especially when the amounts required are really not that high. Indeed, we know that actually most jihadi plots has costed about less than $10,000, some of them much less than that. So this affordability is important because it allows self-starters to finance without the need for foreign patronage. In fact, only a small minority of plots have been directly funded by Al-Qaeda or ISIS. So petty crime is sufficient, especially if combined with perfectly legal sources of funding like personal savings. So that's enough for individuals or networks to operate autonomously and self-sufficiently. And this allows them to carry out attacks that are low cost, but still cause serious public alarm. And finally, what we call ideological confluence takes place when former criminals turn extremists through a process of indoctrination. In this, we need to understand that one of the fundamental strengths of the jihadi narrative is that it can offer redemption to self-doubting criminals. To these individuals, joining the global jihad is presented as an opportunity to make up for their past sins. And to do so by applying the skills and abilities that they develop over years, but this time for an altruistic cause. So in a nutshell, it offers them the possibility to transition from a negative identity, that of a criminal, to what is in their eyes a far more positive one, a holy warrior, a soldier of Allah. And a key place where this process of identity transition may happen is prisons. Prisons are the premier place for criminals and jihadists to mix. In fact, European penitentiaries have long been described as incubators for radical Islamism. Places where skills are acquired and connections are made that may prove useful for future attacks. More importantly, other scholars have written about how these are places where cognitive openings can happen. Indeed, criminologists have known for years that serving a sentence may lead young, sometimes vulnerable people to reassess their lives and engage in personal change. But this also gives an opening to charismatic inmates to exploit these young prisoners' search for belonging and recruit them into the jihad. Indeed, research shows that the influence of authoritative jihadi leaders and access to extremist propaganda are pull factors that are far more important for radicalization than push factors such as overcrowding or poor conditions within prisons. So, regardless of how we choose to define these processes, the practical implications are significant. In principle, one may think that criminals may make for more effective terrorists. They benefit from using all skills, and they have access to contacts and resources. But interestingly, this may not be the case in practice. Actually, research in the US on prosecuted and deceased ISIS members has shown that prior involvement in crime had little discernible impact on the actual success of the plot. So I think that we need more evidence on that front. Nonetheless, previous involvement in violent crime is still an issue in itself. It means that those individuals have already crossed an important threshold in the process of radicalization. Indeed, more recent research in the US has indicated that those who had engaged in violent criminal acts before radicalizing are about twice more likely to carry out political violence. And this is a very significant figure. Moreover, it's been argued that a previous history of criminal violence might shorten the time between individual radicalization and the terrorist attack, what is being described by some as the flash to bang period. And finally, there is the matter of the appropriate policy responses. All these issues highlight how there are tools that are maybe far more important for fighting terrorism than we thought in the past. including reintegration policies, risk assessment tools for prisoners, or the work by community programs preventing gun violence. So it is clear that monitoring terrorist recruiters inside and outside prisons is important, but so is having a greater understanding of the sort of processes that make terrorist activity attractive and appealing to young adults involved in crime in our societies. And with that point, I'd like to conclude. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your comments and questions.